Good morning, everybody. Fantastic. For those who are walking in, just CEU information is in the back at that round table. So you'll need to log in, time in and time out. I'll be saying that again as I read the slides. Welcome everyone to our session on creating flood resilient landscapes in New Jersey. With a big thank you to all of our sponsors. We appreciate all the efforts and that you give to us. A little housekeeping. This is for the virtual side of the presentation. For those who are online, we are starting the session. If you can't hear us, make sure your stream is enabled in Zoom, and then instructions are being uploaded into the chat. Housekeeping for those in person, please silence your devices if you have them on you. During the Q&A, speak loudly and clearly, please. Virtually, please don't silence your electronic devices. Use the Q&A function to ask questions and reach out to us at the conference at thewatershed.org if you experience any technical difficulties. So during the Q&A for virtual, click the Q&A button on Zoom to ask questions. You can upvote or comment on other questions that are asked. In person, that's you guys right here. Raise your hand and the moderator will call on you. Please speak loudly and clearly. And the moderator might repeat your question if it is difficult for the Zoom attendees to hear. CEU logistics. So the credits offered for the session are PE, the APA Planner CM, APA Planner SR, and the CFM. So if you are in need of these, please, you must sign in with your full name, the time in and time out at that circle table in the back, or automatically virtually, please use your full name. You must attend this entire session to receive credit. CEU logistics, there's a required form. The electronic and physical forms are available per session under session resources or inside the room. So joining us today are our speakers. We have Brooke Maslow, PhD. She's an associate professor with the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University, and the Extension Specialist in Wildlife Ecology at the Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Her work focuses on the effective translation of scientific research into practical conservation directives, specifically linking biodiversity to the provisioning of ecosystem services. We also have Thomas Flynn, environmental specialist, floodplain administrator, FEMA and CRS coordinator in the township of Woodbridge, New Jersey. He holds a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University and a master's from the City University of New York. Mr. Flynn is the township of Woodbridge environmental specialist, floodplain administrator, FEMA and CRS coordinator, and supports OEM recovery. And also we have Brian Friedlich. He has served 20 years of expertise in the field of water resources and engineering. His focus has been on stormwater management, watershed planning, ecological restoration, and wastewater treatment. He has led design, permitting, and construction administration for many large-scale infrastructure improvement projects throughout the region. Please join me in meeting our speakers today. Thank you so much. And now our presentation commences.
Morning. Thanks for the really warm introduction. It makes it seem like we know something up here, which is a little scary. I'm not sure if that's the case, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk to you guys today. I guess I'm kind of setting everything in context, so I'm going to give us a bit of an overview of some of the work that we've been doing, and I think that some of the other stuff will go in depth with Tom and Brian. Okay. Let me figure out how to work this thing. Cool. Okay. So despite being a relatively small state, New Jersey actually has almost 1,800 miles of coastline. and close to 6,500 miles of river. And I have a map on the right there. The image on the right is showing you basically mapped all of the 100-year flood zones in New Jersey. And if you just look at that briefly, it comes pretty clear to you very quickly that there's not really much in New Jersey that is constituted as higher ground. In addition to that, about a third of the state's land area is developed, and a lot of that coincides with, within or in close proximity to those flood zones. So here I'm just kind of showing you a very dramatic picture of Beach Haven West, which is west of Long Beach Island, which you can see kind of in the distance there. And as we all know, infrastructure and water don't really mix too well. And so, sort of taken all together, most of the municipalities in the state have been affected by flooding in one way or another. So just to throw some more numbers at you, New Jersey also ranks in the upper half of the United States in casualties and property damage resulting from flood events. So here I'm just showing you damages and losses from flooding from 1960 to 2020. Now, most of these numbers are, coming from Hurricane Sandy, and they're already outdated, although I did just get an email that they updated this database. So, if you think about Ida and some of the other unnamed storms or the nor'easters, right, you can see that these numbers would go even higher. And the frequency of these storm events and these flood events are increasing. So here on this graphic, I don't know if you can see the text, but it doesn't really matter. These are just different locations within the United States, and it's showing you the average number of flood events per year. And then the bars, the different color bars are showing you, so it's basically from, I think it's from the 1950s up through 2015, and each of those bars is representing a 20-year time period. So you can kind of see that I've circled here Atlantic City and Sandy Hook, but you can see that the trend of those bars is increasing with each 20-year period. In addition to that, there was a 2018 report from the Union of Concerned Scientists that estimated that in New Jersey, about 25,000 properties are at risk of chronic flooding by 2035. And then, of course, that number skyrockets by if you project out to 2100. So taken together, all of that is just to say that we have a flooding problem in New Jersey. Now, when most people think of flooding, right, maybe not the people in this room, but most people out there, they sort of drum up these images of catastrophic flooding, right? So we immediately think about things like Hurricane Sandy, when the New York City subway flooded, or when the Manahawkin Bridge collapsed, or when the Atlantic Ocean and the bays met along all the barrier islands, right? Or the lower left panel here, we have the flash floods from Hurricane Ida, right? And we kind of, we think of those images, but a sizable portion of the flood insurance claims for New Jersey actually comes from flooding that's not associated with a major storm event like that. We have a lot of friends here in New Jersey, like sea level rise and subsidence and impervious cover, and all of those things, right, interact so that flooding, even after typical rainstorms or even just sunny day flooding, right, it becomes kind of a common event here in the state. And so when we think of those things, we recognize, whether we want to or not, that a managed retreat from flood zones is a necessary component of, some kind of resilience, flood resilience for our communities. And so we focus a lot on this idea of resilience, right? But what exactly is resilience, right? When we think about communities and how we can make them more robust and more resilient to climate change and to flooding in particular, you can ask 100 different people what resilience is, and you'll get 100 different answers. And so we kind of think of resilience as having these three components. And I'm an ecologist at heart, and so I'll start with ecological resilience. So the capacity of an ecosystem to tolerate disturbance without switching to a different ecological state, right? But we also have economic resilience, the ability of an individual, business, or larger entity to recover from or adjust to the disruption of a market equilibrium. And then we have social resilience, the ability to cope with and adapt with adversity and to enhance well-being in the face of present and future risk. right? So again, we sort of think of community resilience as this three-pronged initiative or objective. So when we embark on a landscape resilience initiative, especially in the context again of flooding, we think about goals in the context or in the framework of that resilience. And so these are the four that we've settled on. Resilience Goal 1, protect human health and safety, right? First and foremost, get people out of harm's way. Resilience Goal 2, protect property and infrastructure, critical infrastructure especially. Resilience Goal 3, enhance integrity and function of natural areas. And then, of course, empower communities. So if I start with Resilience Goal 1, protect human health and safety, right? Get people out of harm's way. We do that through some sort of managed retreat, right? Some sort of property acquisition program. And in New Jersey, the leading initiative in the state is the Blue Acres program. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with that program, run by NJDEP. This program has, not only been successful here, but it's really become a model for the country on how we go about these types of managed retreat initiatives. And so just to give you a few of the key points of the Blue Acres program. So it's a voluntary buyout program. Typically, funding is coming from federal sources. It's transferred into the state, and then the state goes ahead and acquires flood-prone properties. They try to do that in clusters so that you have sort of these nodes of resilience areas. Once those properties are acquired, they become, they're owned by the state of New Jersey. They're deed restricted, so there are no, new permanent structures, no piping, no hard flood mitigation structures, and they're to be managed as open space, right? So things like wetland management, passive recreation, parks, those kinds of things. So typically what occurs is that the management of these properties falls onto the jurisdiction within, where those properties are located. So the town in which those properties are located. So, okay. With the removal of structures, right, resilience is immediately increased. We're getting people and property out of harm's way. And that's a great thing. And for a long time, we've sort of thought about the buyout as the end game, right? We've achieved our resilience criteria, and we're good to go. But after the buyout, there's actually several new challenges emerge. And those challenges, I've kind of summed them up in this graphic here. Those challenges can be ecological and environmental, or they can be social or some kind of management-oriented challenge. And so, first of all, I'll talk about kind of the ecological effects, right? So when you think about the landscape itself, previously developed parcels are not inherently resilient, right? That they suffer from things like compaction, right? Those legacy effects of previous development. So whether it's compacted soils, poor nutrient soils, maybe no soil at all. You have things like invasive species, right? Those contamination could potentially be an issue, those types of things. Not only do you have the stressors that are happening, those legacy effects right on the parcels, right, within your project zone, but again, these are properties that are within a sea of development, right? So you have these low-lying areas surrounded by upland developed areas that are outside of the flood zones and not places that are eligible for buyouts, of course. And so where does water go? It likes to go down, right? And so what you have is flooding and non-point source pollution and all those things, right, coming down into these project areas. And that will continue and has to be thought about as you move forward. Again, within the landscape itself, there are these social challenges that you need to deal with, things like, as properties are coming out of the neighborhood, other individuals maybe didn't accept a buyout or can accept a buyout or something like that, but they're still remaining in the neighborhood. And then you have these properties that are going away, right? So you have this sense of loss and abandonment, right? And we don't really like to feel that way generally as humans. there's also, as I mentioned, now this newfound open space, and the responsibility of management of that open space falls typically on the municipality in which those parcels are located. And so you have funding issues, person power issues, right? And coupled with that, right, these are all sort of intertwined. But you have things like differing expectations of outcomes. So if I'm a person who maybe is living on, on the outside of the flood zone, looking in at this buyout area, I would like those properties to be mowed and to look more like an English garden or a park or something like that. Whereas, a resilient landscape, an ecosystem is going to be more wild and natural, right? And again, it's placing these burdens, again, with finances and person power in managing the landscapes on the Department of Public Works, for example. When you have an exodus from an area, then those landscapes then become, as we all know, places for potentially inappropriate uses, ATVs, people doing things in the woods at night, those sorts of things. Fun as I mean, we've all been there. Okay, moving on, right? So there's all these challenges. So I now want to kind of switch a little bit to talking about how we address some of these challenges using Woodbridge Township as a case study. And again, I'm going to kind of give my ecological sort of overview, and then I'll let my counterparts over there talk about some of the details of the nitty gritty. But again, so Woodbridge Township, it's in a coastal county, Middlesex County. You can see, am I allowed to move? I'll talk really loudly. So the township is bisected by the Woodbridge River here. You can see Warren down in the south, and eventually the Woodbridge River empties into the Arthur Kill. You can see there's a lot of blue there that indicates the special flood hazard area. And so after Hurricane Sandy, and I'm sure Tom will talk about that a little bit more, but the township was very, very proactive in initiating or facilitating the acquisition of many, many properties within the township. And so I have five white boxes that indicate the focal areas within the township where Blue Acres buyouts from Sandy occurred. I'm going to be focusing, and I think the rest of us will be focusing mostly on the three in the center. So you have Avenel in the north, Watson Crampton just below that, the Watson Crampton neighborhood, and then below that is the Seawarren neighborhood. And those are all neighborhoods that occur along the Woodbridge River. Okay, so I'm going to also, in the next slide, zoom in. I don't know if you can see where you're at, but the black portions within those neighborhoods represent the properties that were acquired by the state. So I'm going to zoom into the Watson Crampton neighborhood in the middle there. And that's where initially 87% of the buyout properties were concentrated. So you're going to kind of see that sort of that shape. What happened? Well, I definitely don't have a slide in here. Bummer. Okay, well, I did have a slide in here. I'm not sure what happened to it. But it basically showed you kind of the before and after aerial footage or aerial image of all of the houses within the project area. And then fast forward to just a year ago, I think is when the image was taken, and you can see that all those houses are gone. And I think Tom will talk probably more about some of the social and regulatory pieces and components of how that happened and how that neighborhood was designated after these acquisitions. But I want to talk a little bit more about the ecology because again, that's kind of the stuff that I think about and that I do. So again, we know that biodiversity creates ecosystem function, right? It's responsible for things like nutrient cycling and infiltration and carbon sequestration and all that good stuff. And so first, when we, again, are looking at these properties, we need to know the baseline of what was there, right? So, we come in and we do our wildlife surveys, our bird surveys, our amphibian surveys, deer, for obvious reasons, surveys, native and invasive vegetations, what kind of soil are there? Are there species of ecological significance, threatened and endangered species? Are there habitats we want to highlight? Those kinds of things to kind of give us this sort of grand plan and a roadmap for what we want and where we're going with this long-term plan. And again, what's different about what we're doing as opposed to what typical ecological restoration projects do is that when we embark on a restoration project, typically, right, we have this nice evenly defined project boundary, and everything inside that project boundary becomes places that we can provide some kind of intervention. But when we're working in these types of landscapes, as you can see in this conceptual design, we still have quite a few homes in there. So we can't think about a 5-year plan for these types of things. We have to think about more of a 30-year plan, right? The life of a mortgage. And there's lots of different challenges to that as well. But again, we have to think about how can we increase biodiversity, how can we increase ecosystem function, flood storage, and all of those things, while also paying attention to the opportunities that these buyouts have for socioeconomic gains, turning these landscapes into public assets. And so here I'm showing you our conceptual plan, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but what I want to show you here is that we kind of look at these landscapes as having 3 sort of defined zones. So again, this is Watson Crampton. I'm going to come over here again. This is the Woodbridge River coming along the east side of our neighborhood. This is the Herds Brook, which is on the south end of our neighborhood. And we're kind of sandwiched in between those 2 things. There's Salt Marsh up to the northeast as you move up the map there. And so we have these 3 restoration zones. The first one is the actual restoration zone, which you can see on the bottom. And there we're saying, okay, we need to put in a mosaic of habitat types that are redundant. So many of them, in case something happens to one, you have source populations of plants and animals, you know, to allow that ecosystem to rebound. We have scrub shrub forest, we have floodplain forest, high marsh, salt marsh, those kinds of things. And then we have kind of this interface between the restoration zone or the true wild area and where the developed zone is. And that's what we call our low maintenance management zone. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a few minutes. But here's where we have kind of the green infrastructure interventions like bioswales and rain gardens and those kinds of things. We have lower vegetation, right? And again, trying to separate the urban or the developed from the wild. And then we have a mode buffer between those 2 things to kind of, again, help with that visual separation. And then we try to add, and I think Brian will talk a little bit more about these things, but we try to add that landscape architecture feel to things too. Trails, signs. This one had a kayak launch that was initially proposed. There's an overlook that is proposed actually in this area that I believe Brian will show you later, which is pretty cool. So again, turning these places into public assets. But again, there are challenges. So we don't have a lot of space and a lot of room to work. So here's an example of just a 2-acre, so the darker green vegetation here, this spot and this spot, that's all Phragmites dominated wetland. Let's see if you can also see in here, probably can't, maybe I can. That is a gas main, which kind of, you know, causes a problem. Can't really do anything with that. And then, so here we have this restoration zone that we need to take care of and deal with water, use it as an opportunity to store water, infiltrate, treat, those kinds of things before the water empties back out into the Woodbridge River with this gas main in the way. So the other thing you can't see, but I'm going to show you anyway. So this is Watson Avenue. This goes south to north in Watson Crampton. If you follow this vegetation line, there were houses all along this section, and there's a ditch that came along the road, made a 90-degree turn, another 90-degree turn, and then eventually entered into the first wetland area here. And so part of our restoration design was to get rid of that 90-degree angle issue and create a forested wetland and basically take that 90-degree turn out and restore that natural curvature. Again, working in a very small area, but restore that natural curvature to collect the water that's coming from upland through the ditch. Some of the ditch remains, and then it empties into a series of wetland depressions. does whatever it wants to do until it gets over the gas line and then moves into the second section of the wetland and then eventually empties out. Here's just some pictures of what that looks like. You know, we've got our swale coming through. Of course, there's still a road, if you can imagine the road over here. So we've got to do some kind of, you know, water distribution feature to make sure that we're not causing any more erosion. We're doing massive native plantings of trees and herbaceous plants to allow this to be a completely vegetated wetland, again, while trying to thwart the Phragmites dominated vegetation. I should tell you too that funding is always an issue. And so a lot of this work was funded with small grants. Why am I blanking? The partnership for corporate wetlands partnership, that one. And the township, Department of Public Works. So here's just another picture showing you a little bit of the immediate after of the forested wetland. Okay, and then other problems come up too. So here, Clare Avenue. So Watson Avenue no longer exists. That's that sort of dirt road moving up to the upper right of this picture. And once these houses were removed here, you can see the small numbers 79, 91, those were all lots. So once all that was removed, water coming down Clare Avenue then began to pool in front of the last house remaining, whereas before it used to sort of continue through some of the sewers. And so, okay, we have to put a fix there. So this general section here, 1,200 square foot rain garden to deal with that issue. And that sort of came up. And again, that wasn't necessarily planned. But here's our design. And again, I don't want to go through a lot of details about it. But again, we kind of have this series of stone features, vegetated depression areas. And this took care of that problem. So you have to kind of think out of the box and put these small interventions in to deal with some of these issues, again, while keeping people content. Here's a picture of the construction of that wetland. And it looks pretty dry. And we actually were concerned that we maybe designed it wrong. And then we went over and took a step in the rain garden once it was vegetated and sunk. And we thought, wow, okay, great. So it works. Okay, vegetation, invasive vegetation, always a problem. So in all of the lots, again, if you think about these lots not being mowed, then what comes in? Phragmites, Milominate, mugwort, all kinds of fun stuff. And so I show you this picture because, again, these are lots. So houses were removed here. These are two folks from my staff who were doing some invasive species, so Phragmites herbicide application in partnership with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And if you see just a year later, now we planted the trees, you can see the trees with the tree shelters. But if you do get rid of and manage the invasive species, some of those better competitors will come back in. So you can see the white flowers there, the bone set. So that was all from seed bank that came up. And so some management gives you some good returns. I always like to show the picture of the common milkweed that came in as well too. Okay, and then another challenge is again defining that edge, right? Keeping people happy on one side, maintaining biodiversity on the other, and how do we do that? And so we did come up with this symbolic edge that seems to work pretty well. So here's a cross section, just a theoretical, okay, here's your property line. You can see where the fence ends. Then we would have a mowed buffer. So again, the Department of Public Works comes in and mows weekly or maybe monthly. And then we have a native tree border, a landscape tree border that eventually goes into meadow and then larger and thicker and higher vegetation. So I just want to show you what that looks like. So here's our cross section. And then if you kind of think about it, here we've got our mowed buffer, our fence, and our meadow. Okay, and I just want to show you a before and after of Watson Crampton, or Watson Avenue. So here's the Google image of Watson Avenue prior to all this work. This is what it looks like afterwards. And you wouldn't know there was a road there except for those utility poles. I just want to show you, and again, because these are kind of the success pictures, but this is an old basketball court that we removed, the township removed. We replanted with wet meadow vegetation, swamp milkweed especially, and a bunch of other things, and that's what it looks like now. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is just the human dimensions, which is that once we do all of this work, right, we want to invite people back into these places. And so we spent a lot of time preparing signs to indicate what you can and can't do. So where, you know, property owners can mow, you can mow up to this point. You can't mow past this. Please don't mow past this. We put in at least a mile of trails in this neighborhood, along with trailhead signs and some interpretive signs to kind of give you the ecology of the site, something to look for, why we're doing it, and then something that you can do at home. And then I will finish with a small commercial, which is that, you know, so Woodbridge is a prime example of this type of landscape resilience initiative that it's a long-term. There's lots of stuff that we're doing here. A lot of the principles are not new. These are just things that we've integrated and put all together in this interdisciplinary approach. And so we were funded a few years ago by the DEP's Resilient NJ program to put together a primer on how you create flood resilient landscapes in New Jersey. And it's got some heft to it. I've brought about 20 copies. If folks want to grab one, please do. It'll be lighter for me to walk back to the car. But it takes you from that, you know, planning the resilience framework all the way through managing a restoration landscape. It's got ecology, landscape architecture, engineering, funding, all kinds of things in there. The idea was to put it all together in a kind of a one-stop shop. If you don't grab one, it's also available online for you there. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Brooke. We'll hold questions to the end. I will introduce my presentation here. So I'm Brian Friedlich. Mentioned before, I am an engineer with One Water Consulting. We've been working with Rutgers on the engineering of some of these projects. So my presentation is on engineering concepts for resilient restoration design. It should really be unengineering or de-engineering. You know, the philosophy throughout all of this is how do we get things from being in the, you know, built to get bought out by Blue Acres? How do we get that back to a naturalized, restored environment? So we're kind of thinking differently than a typical civil engineer would. So starting here with the urban hydrologic cycle, all of these projects start and end with hydrology. It's kind of the basis of everything. So we're starting with the built environment here, and there's a lot of impacts of development. And frankly, a lot of the reasons we have to go in and buy out these properties is because of the impacts of urbanization and development. So as we increase impervious surfaces, we're increasing stormwater runoff from these areas, more frequent increased flooding, less water going down into the ground, less infiltration, reduced groundwater recharge, lower flows in streams during dry weather conditions, which impacts water quality, as well as with all that increased runoff carrying in pollutants from the impervious surfaces in the urbanized areas, increasing pollutant loadings on those waterways and downstream surface waters. And looking at a hydrograph, those of you that are engineers out there, you understand that a hydrograph is the flow over time of a stream or of runoff. And with post-development, that upper curve there, that would represent a post-development or urbanized runoff hydrograph. And you can see the flow is higher, the peak of the curve there in the post-development, as well as the volume of water. So that's the volume underneath the curve is much higher with the post-development versus a naturalized pre-development condition. And, you know, we can go and calculate this using H&H hydrology, hydraulics modeling programs. We can calculate what the flow rates are. We can calculate what the depth in a waterway would be. So we have all the tools in order to understand what the hydrology of an urbanized area is. And as a result of this, we've seen flooding impacts over the last several decades. Brooke showed a number of photographs also. And, flooding impacts both in non-tidal fluvial areas like Manville, New Jersey, during Irene, New Brunswick during Ida, and as well as tidal impacts of Sandy there in the bottom right. We all saw all those scenes of flooding during Sandy, which was a tidal event. So looking now at some of these restoration projects we're working with, and how do we understand hydrology? Some of these projects, well, most of these projects are located in tidal areas. And so we can't necessarily use those H&H tools to understand the total picture of the hydrology. So we need to understand the tidal fluctuations. And you might have a site that has a tidal station nearby already, or a tide gauge that's nearby that you can use. For Woodbridge, we did not have that. So we did tidal station monitoring, where we actually installed in situ devices in the waterways to understand what the tidal fluctuations were. So we're measuring water level, we're measuring barometric pressure so we can understand what those elevations are. We're measuring temperature and salinity at those stations. And some look at the data that we collected. I'm going to show two different graphs here. The first is further upstream in that Woodbridge restoration area. And this is right near where the tidal influence starts to affect the waterway. So this is on Woodbridge Creek. And the blue line there is the water levels. The red line is the salinity. And you can see a lot of these curves in the graph are more of a traditional hydrograph, like I was showing you before. It kind of comes up and down with precipitation events. You can see a little bit when it gets down low, you start to see some fluctuations if you look closely. And those are those tidal fluctuations starting to impact it, especially during non-storm events. When storms come through, that really is the predominant impact or predominant factor that's causing the water levels in the stream. And then we'll compare this now with Port Reading, which is further downstream. This here is tidally influenced almost entirely. So you can see here the blue lines coming up and down substantially, kind of fluctuating between 2 and -2, so 4 to 6 foot swing of elevation. So a decent tidal swing here. And then you can see the salinity following along with that, much higher than it was in the upstream. I'm going to flip back to that one. I don't think I mentioned that. So you can see the red line of salinity here, very low across the whole monitoring period. The only times it came up was during low flow conditions. So when you had dry periods, we start seeing that tidal fluctuation. That's bringing in some of that salt influence. And knowing what the salinity concentrations are is really important with the design and trying to bring this back to a natural ecosystem to understand what type of plants that we're going to select and understand the type of marsh that we're dealing with. So talking about some of these marsh ecosystems, the first is a freshwater marsh ecosystem and hydrology. So this would be something similar to that upstream section. This graph here this picture here shows kind of on the right side of it being a naturalized condition, the left side being kind of this Blue Acres property area that's not restored yet. And so the goal here is to try to restore these areas more back to a naturalized condition. And understanding that hydrology is really important. So unlike a saline marsh or a tidally influenced marsh, these are flood-dependent ecosystems. The hydrology is based on that, the water levels from storm events and the hydrology of the watershed producing runoff. Now compare that to a saline marsh ecosystem where we have a tidally influenced system. You can see the different, the mean high tide level, all of these marsh areas, the low marsh, high marsh, are based on where they are in the tide cycle. So there might be some areas that get inundated just an hour a day. There might be some areas that are inundated all day. And some of them might depend on where you are in the tidal cycle. So understanding that hydrology is really important. That's why that tidal monitoring is really important. So we know exactly at our restoration sites where those water elevations will be throughout the course of the year. I'll mention, when we did those tidal monitoring stations, an important part of that is to know where they are in relation to the ground. So we set up benchmarks at each one of those. So it might be like the top rail of the bridge, right? That might be the benchmark that we then hard survey that point so we can convert all the depths of water to actual elevations on the restoration site. And then we have floodplains. These are the areas around the actual streams, or in this case, Woodbridge Creek. And the floodplains are really important, especially for our projects where we're looking at flood resilience. And the floodplains have a flood fringe, which is along the sides of the stream, and then the floodway, which is the fast-moving water in the channelized areas of the stream. Again, here has a naturalized condition on the left side, a built-up area on the right side that would look more like the Blue Acres buyout type property areas. And we're trying to restore these riparian zones, these buffers adjacent to the streams for water quality and for water quantity, right? So we want these areas to soak up water. We want these areas to function as wetlands. So you can see on the left side, there's a wetland adjacent to the, that's actually in the flood fringe in the naturalized condition. So we're trying to restore these functions of water quality and acting as a sponge for water quantity, putting in things like bioswales, water quality features. And I'll talk about some of those coming up here. So one of the interventions engineering concepts that we are incorporating into a lot of these projects is stream bank stabilization and restoration, stream restoration in general. And there's some photographs here of different projects, different types of interventions that we are looking at and implementing. So from a stabilization standpoint, there's a picture of biologs going in for stabilization. There's a picture in the middle top of a deflector using stone and timber. And all of these are kind of geared towards moving energy, right, away from the sides of the stream towards the center of the stream. In general, a lot of times in these streams that are urbanized, you get much higher velocities than would have occurred in a natural condition. They're not, Mother Nature didn't design them to handle all the flow from these urbanized areas. So we're trying to focus energy away from those stream banks towards the center with the deflectors. We have on the bottom right some pictures of root wads, which help again to move water and energy away from the banks, using rocks and boulders as a key for the slopes, using soil lifts along kind of a terraced approach along the banks to allow for vegetation to actually establish. So a lot of times you've had erosion and it just wipes out all the vegetation. So how do we stabilize it now so the vegetation can survive? And then on the bottom left, just doing riparian plantings along streams and waterways. I also wanted to talk here about about wetland creation and enhancement. A lot of the projects we're working on, some of the pictures that Brooke showed was of a wetland, forested wetland project. So these constructed wetlands, we're looking at expanding maybe an existing wetland or creating a wetland to manage stormwater runoff, water from those urbanized areas. This happens to be some photographs of a picture that was in Philadelphia where it was heavily urbanized. So you can even do these projects in very urbanized areas. The stream was basically underground in a pipe and a diversion structure was put in to allow water to go into this naturalized new constructed wetland. And just talking about some of the design criteria, we're looking at different zones of plantings, different zones of hydrology within that freshwater wetland. And again, this isn't a saline, tidally influenced area. So we're looking at kind of a constant water level in general during non-storm conditions. And These could range from a deep pool that's many feet deep, 4 to 6 feet deep, and then high marsh and low marsh zones that are 6-inch depth to 1.5 foot depth. Typically, we have larger contributory drainage areas for these types of designs, 10 to 25 acres. For smaller drainage areas, that could be possible if you have the hydrology from groundwater to support a wetland. So that is possible. You want to be able to do a water budget for those types of designs. And then these systems can also have extended detention where they're providing some more flood prevention, flood resiliency benefits with them. So for looking at the marsh restoration now, so some of the restoration sites involve these larger expansive marshes. And we're looking at ways that we can improve the resiliency and the habitat and the hydrology of the marshes. So some of the goals that we're looking at accomplishing are managing invasives, as Brooke mentioned before, recovery through revegetation. So we're looking at managing those invasives and replanting with a more diverse community. Managing the hydrology and tidal exchange. Some of these marshes have areas that have been cut off, right, from the hydrology of the overall marsh. So how do we restore, reconnect some of these areas to that hydrology? Creating habitat diversity. And on the bottom here, there's a diagram of kind of a concept that we've come up with for creating shade islands within the marsh where we can do some more plantings of woody vegetation. What we found is a lot of the invasive removals are very hard to maintain. It just comes back. So how do we change the dynamics, create shade within the marshes to get more success of establishment of native diverse vegetation? And then finally, creating floodplain storage. A lot of these areas have become dominated by frag. There's very large root mats. You end up with kind of very channelized areas within them and not a lot of access for that floodplain during a lot of conditions. So how do we change the dynamics? And what we're looking at is removing the root mat from portions of these marshes, removing the frag, removing the root mat, and kind of creating a new microtopography through the area as we go and replant it. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, move on to some green infrastructure, because a lot of these projects, we're looking at the marshes and the wetlands, but we also want to manage runoff from the area. So looking at bioretention systems and rain gardens, these are areas that can soak up water from the urbanized areas, manage it. Brooke showed some photographs before. We're actually going in is putting in a different type of soil that can act as a sponge, soak up that water and allow it to infiltrate and get back into the ground. Using vegetative filters and swales. A lot of these are piped conveyance systems in these Blue Acres properties. How do we disconnect that water from those areas, put it into more of a vegetative conveyance? I have a diagram here of a check dam approach that allows water to slow down more easily in these vegetated areas. And the picture on the right is for one of the projects for Woodbridge, a design with a bioswale and rain garden that will help collect water from a surrounding roadway there. We also go in and establish trails and boardwalks with a lot of these projects. We want these to be a public amenity. One thing that comes to mind is we did recently we did a walkthrough of one of the sites that has already been constructed, a field trip there, and unexpectedly there was a father and a daughter, maybe son, that was walking through, and he just raved about how great it is that there's trails here now. It was an eyesore before. So this is really important for the community aspect, which Tom is going to talk about. But with the Blue Acres program, sometimes you end up with this eyesore of a ghost town almost, where you have just scattered houses and dead-end streets, and it's the opposite of an amenity. So how do we turn that into something positive? And just looking at some of these designs moving forward, we have a phase we're working on that's funded through National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to do additional work in Woodbridge Township that I've been working on. So Brooke mentioned Avenel. This project includes a wetland creation area, bioswale, restoration of marsh, bank stabilization. So this is all areas that are upstream in the kind of the areas that are less tidally influenced. Establishing recreational trails and boardwalks. That's that yellow area in there. That's that spine that's going to go through that Brooke showed a picture of before of the whole restoration area, as well as a lot of forested wetland plantings throughout the project area. Sea Warren is now in the tidally influenced area. So we're looking at doing salt marsh restoration here. We're actually going to do a new wetland creation area where we're going to have a diversion structure for taking some of the runoff that just gets piped right into the waterways and diverting into a constructed wetland area, creating green space amenities in Blue Acres properties, some additional recreational trails and plantings. And then finally, Brooke mentioned the overlooked project area. The picture here on the right is what it looks like now, which is basically like a gravel, people use it for parking. But it's goes right up to the stream, which is tidally influenced here as well. And so we're looking at restoring that stream bank, creating public access here to work with the trail system, adding stream buffer vegetation. We're going to do some bioretention to manage stormwater runoff and improve habitat. And then this would kind of serve as an entrance for the overall restoration area around Watson Crampton, that kind of lower project area. And this is just a rendering of the design of what we were looking at for the overlook, which includes boardwalks that would go over the revegetated area along Woodbridge Creek. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom, and he could talk about the hard stuff, which is people kind of bringing everybody together, creating a collaboration basically. So yep.
Good morning still, everyone. And as a humble civil servant, realizing that I stand between you and lunch, I will keep it as brief as possible. So just to start, let me just back up for one moment. You guys have heard a lot of different terms of, is this going to do this? How do I stop this? Is it going to keep going?
I think it's on like autoplay somehow.
All right, we're gonna roll with it. So you guys have heard a lot of different terminology about Woodbridge. We're 10 towns, 10 unincorporated towns under one community, over 350 years old. As you can see, we have a ton of surface water. We're tidally influenced and fluvial influenced. And I bring that up because it's important to mention, because as we look at these flood maps that Brooke and Brian have kindly provided for us, we have over 3,000 acres of regulatory floodplain, a ton of different water resources to manage. Wow. Okay. So we're actually one of the first towns to be recognized as a coastal destination in the state. Back in before the automobile folks came to parts of Sea Warren by boat, and it was a coastal retreat area. There was a hotel, dance hall, a Ferris wheel, and a lot of folks don't realize that. And just to show where Watson Crampton floodplain is in relation to the Boynton Beach historical area, right? So during Sandy, tidal elevations reached about 12.5 feet in the lower Woodbridge River. What that meant for the town and what that meant for resiliency looked a lot different, right? So resilience now rolls off the tongue, right? People use that word everywhere. That wasn't always the case. But what was always the case was a partnership that Woodbridge had between Rutgers and Dr. Maslow, and just a beautiful nature-based education that we had worked on for years together. So we took that and we basically expanded upon that after Sandy, and we said, listen, we have these buyout areas now. We have over 170 parcels that were bought out? How do we expand our partnership and continue to grow these ecological services and just not leave it as mow and go lots? I'll skip this. You guys know the impacts of floodplain development by now. But what we did was a lot of planning work, right? So DCA funded 3 different studies in the Watson Crampton neighborhood, also in the Seawarren neighborhood, and in the Avenel neighborhood. And we looked at everything that Brian and Brooke started to talk about earlier, which was regard to how do we make these lots not just, you know, checkerboards, right? How do we make this a public amenity? How do we make this something that one of the things that I love that our mayor always says is, you know, people see this as managed retreat. I hate that term. And he constantly will say, this is not managed retreat. This is an attack on a problem. You have to reframe this, folks. If we keep calling it managed retreat, no one's going to want to do shit about it. And that's the truth. So this is a really great example of how we continue to work with Brooke and Brian. This is one of our field inspectors in engineering, and I think Brooke right there. And just, you know, basically how we got, you know, to where we are today, right? So these are on the ground images of, you know, how our DPW interacts and works directly with Brooke and her team. And why we work directly with their team, right? So I know Brooke touched on this a little bit, you know, to protect the residents and to restore natural floodplain functions. And these are the maps that Brian highlighted earlier, right? So we focused in on these specific areas. We looked at floodplains. We looked at where folks may be interested in buyouts, how the outreach would occur. And this one is really important, I think, because Colonia is fluvial. And we've not done enough there. We're still working on it, but the image to the right is from Ida. That structure was not deemed substantially damaged. That's a federal issue. It's an apartment complex and every single unit is individually tax assessed. So even though the entire lower level was gutted, it didn't reach 50%. That's a federal issue and we need to work on that. So again, Woodbridge proper and Avenel. Woodbridge proper is where the Watson Crampton buyouts were focused on. So when Brooke kept, you know, talking about this area here, you could see most of our buyouts were about 150 or so were in that area. Again, Brooke spoke about, you know, this concept of creating a buffer, and the importance of the buffer can't be understated because not everyone's going to like what you're doing, guys. It just is what it is, right? So we have to, as a public servant, I have to field these calls. I have to explain what we're doing. I have to explain that, you know, if you don't want to see geese, then we're not going to mow because geese like mowed areas, you know. So these are conversations that actually have to happen at the local level for these projects to take off. And you know, in addition to that, right, so we also did regulatory stuff, right? So we opened the books and we got to talking about how to actually work within the floodplain itself that's most vulnerable. So we rezoned the area. It's now an open space conservation and resiliency zone. More stringent standards, no new construction, cumulative substantial improvement. What does that boil down to? It's already written. This is all stuff that's already been dictated since the 60s, right? So we're not doing new work. We're just doing innovative work. We're thinking about ways to get to solve these problems, right? And, you know, certainly public perception and outreach, right? So these are images of post-Ida, where we met with members of the community to talk specifically about what was going on, try to explain to folks that what happened during Ida was so outrageous that you would need a storm pipe the size of this room to handle what came down in the time of concentration that it came down. All while staying away from words like climate change. But anyway, we also do a lot of great outreach to property owners in our specific repetitive loss areas. We send this out yearly. Like I said, we sit down and talk to folks about the data, the engineering studies that Brian went over. We talk about how the floodway data correlates to the profile, how the profile correlates to not abstract art, but to actual floodplain maps, and what that means for folks on their actual property surveys. And we sit down, we do these, individual conversations. I do them weekly with folks, right? And it's beneficial because, as we enter this new world of flood disclosure acts and what realtors have to disclose and who has to tell people what, no one knows what's going on. I'm just being honest with you. Like realtors, if there's any realtors in the room, please tell your people to learn this stuff. Or call the towns, right? So again, just closing thoughts. We're as we said, we're exploring new approaches to old problems. And I just can't, overstate enough the amazing partnership with Brooke and Brian, and the immense support from our administration. This stuff doesn't get done if you don't have the support from your mayors, from your governing bodies. It's not from the ground up, guys. It's got to come from the top. So thank you all.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. So we'll open it up for some Q&A. Are you going to go around for? Okay. Great. So I'll take a question from the from Zoom first, maybe? That makes sense?
Sure.
Okay, I would love to hear the presenters speak to the issue that built out towns are now getting pressure to redevelop marginal properties, including areas that flood repeatedly, in housing mixed use in order to meet affordable housing requirements. Even if the built portions of the property is elevated a foot or so, it's still a big issue for public safety in some cases. Towns seem to have a few tools to effectively argue that housing is not safe or appropriate for these properties. Can CCRHVAs be one of the possible tools? Other ideas? Good question.
Regulations. That's the overall thing.
Pressure to redevelop marginal properties, so that pressure that to redevelop properties that really shouldn't be redeveloped. They're kind of
Okay.
marginal. Yeah.
So I would say this. Woodbridge is blessed to be almost 24 square miles. Not every town has that, right? We do a lot of redevelopment outside of our special flood hazard areas. So if you drive through Woodbridge, if you've seen, what's going on, there's, transit-oriented development that's going on near our train stations that's outside of special flood hazard areas, while we're continuing to work with Brooke and Brian on, trails and amenities that will literally connect you to these areas that, for passive recreational use. It's not an easy fix. I would say that, especially for towns that are, 1 or 2 square miles, right? But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. There's entire municipalities that are within special flood hazard areas. How do you handle that? So, but I would just say from my perspective, larger communities have much more opportunities to look elsewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. It was going to be a one-pronged question, now a two-pronged question, owing to the last one and Tom's response. So firstly, are you looking at in any way documenting the nitrogen fixing and filtration benefits of what you're doing in a way that you can then link that and validate its impact on water quality and improving water quality, maintaining water quality? And then second prong suggested, and Tom, by your responses to the last question, owing to the increased extreme precipitation and the revisions to the NOAA atlases for that, and how we're going to have increased areas susceptible to pluvial and fluvial flooding outside the special flood hazards, how you're taking that into account, whether you're incorporating that into the planning of the kind of projects that you've done with Brook, and also in your redevelopment planning, so that you don't find that you've put something that's going to be in future harm's way.
Thanks so much. Yeah, those are great questions. And so I would just say on the water quality issue, that's certainly something that we work with Dr. Maslow on. We have that well documented in a variety of reports that we certainly try to use in different capacities throughout, whether it's applications for new grant funding, looking at ways to ensure that we're doing the right work in the right areas that need the most support. In terms of the increase. What's happening?
That's for Zoom. Oh, that's for Zoom. That's for Zoom. But I'd like to hear the end.
Oh, it should.
You can move.
You could have
Yeah.
a seat and then we'll bring that over there. One moment.
We could solve that problem.
Here you go. Yeah, you can just.
Okay. Apologies. So on the increased precipitation issue, right? So that's, again, that's really important, and it's something, if y'all want to come in the afternoon and hear me speak again for some reason, I will talk a little bit about what we're doing on watershed master planning in the township. So we're doing a variety of efforts that focus on problem site maintenance, so specific choke points that we know that exist within the conveyance system itself. We have SOPs where our inspectors go out before and after storm events under events of 1.5 to 3 inches of predicted rainfall to go out and check these sites. And then our comprehensive plans look at, do we, can we expand the pipe systems? Do we remove the pipe systems? Do we look at green options? So all of those things are being considered in terms of the long run as well. Absolutely.
I'll take a question here from Zoom. How difficult was the permitting process for the restoration areas? And it was easy. We got it like in 1 week and we were done. So, anything else? No, but seriously, one thing that has come up recently, one thing that's come up recently is with some of these projects, they kind of expand because you get new Blue Acres properties. It's great, right? And so we right now are going through a kind of a modification process where we have to go back and redo some of the permitting that was already done. But I will say a lot of this work is covered under general permits, which makes it a little bit easier. You're not going out and getting individual permits, and there aren't really area limits for those types of projects. So we can kind of go in and do large scale projects through general permits. So that's great.
I think this is for Brian or Holly. You guys both mentioned invasive species. And so I was wondering, like Phragmites comes up a lot and it's hard to deal with. Do you ever find that it's easier to work with it? I know in some of the constructed wetlands that I've been part of, it's really good during high flow. It comes back really well and it's durable. It's not great for wildlife, but it does have other benefits. So do you ever find that it's easier to deal with it rather than try to eliminate it?
I'll let Brooke take it. She cares about the wildlife.
Right. So you're right. There is value to invasive species, and there's always a long-term debate about what should go, what should stay, and that sort of thing. And so, I think our goal is not to eradicate Phragmites. Other ones we'd love to eradicate, but I think we know that there's external stressors. I mean, you can spend a lifetime trying to clean one spot, and it's just going to keep coming, right? And so I think, Brian spoke to some of those shade islands within the salt marsh, right? So the idea there is not to remove Phragmites forever, because we know it will come back, but we're trying to abate it now. But then to create these islands so that there's a mosaic of habitat types, increasing biodiversity and representation of all these different species so that we can support multiple wildlife species and such. So yeah, it's definitely it's no love lost, but it's a tolerance for sure.
All right, quick question from Zoom here. Can you expand on the process of rezoning? Is it included in the primer? I think so.
So the rezoning process was an effort that took place primarily in relation to the DCA planning efforts that I spoke about earlier, right? So we took the plans, we did not put them on a shelf, and we basically implemented some of those suggestions. So the rezoning itself obviously is a mechanism of your town councils and how each individual municipality does that, but how the map was drawn was based on elevations in relation to flood elevations, in relation to repetitive loss areas. So all these things were considered when it came to the rezoning efforts. And I will say, not all of Woodbridge special flood hazard areas have been rezoned to open space conservation resiliency areas, but Watson Crampton certainly has.
Thank you. Hi, so thank you for speaking. I know. So my question was kind of about utilities. I mean, I saw that, the gas main and the power lines. Have utilities been open? Not the gas main obviously would be a lot harder, but would, like the PSE&Gs or JCP&Ls be open to taking down those power lines? I'm thinking about, the California wildfire that started because like a piece of metal broke, and I'm just thinking about that, and then a place that's meant to be flooded with water, and all those things. So, is there an openness between utilities and these kind of projects?
Well, we have experience with that. Do you want to talk to it? Because
Yeah, sure.
with the
Yeah,
recent
Yeah.
case too.
Yeah, so I'll say the utility companies that we have been working with have been very receptive. It's not always their top priority, I'll say that. But in terms of working with us to get the projects done, we've always had success with that. I don't know, Brooke, you want to shed a little more light on?
I think I think the only comment I would say is that I think so. Yes, generally, folks are receptive, and there's just a formal process that you have to go through. I think priorities are the issue. I think the only pushback that I don't say pushback, but a little bit of resistance and probably prudently is hydrants and fire lines. And again, because these still are places that the public will access eventually. And so making sure that there's water for in the event of a wildfire. But I think that's everything.
I'll just say one other thing to think about here is you end up with some properties that stay. So that kind of dictates what you can do, right? You're going to have to, you can maybe cap a line, but maybe you can't because it's going to another house that needs service. So the goal is to kind of make it look like it was supposed to be that way. And while removing as much road as you can, because you can't always remove road if people need access.
I want to say thank you so much to our presenters for today. And one final note about CEUs, make sure you sign out if you signed in. And
Did you say that let them know that
there is
hard
also
copies here.
literature at the front as well. Feel free to take.
Can't pass that up.
Have a wonderful lunch.